Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on the overview of revisions to the Professional Standards and Competencies for Early Childhood Educators. I'm Mary Harrill, Senior Director of Higher Education Accreditation here at NAEYC, 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 depending on how you've come to know our association. And we're thrilled that you've joined us for this hour to learn more about the draft, and I underline the word draft, position statement. And before we dig into the focus of today's webinar, I'd like to address just a couple of logistical issues. We've saved time at the end to answer your questions, so feel free to post your questions and comments in the chat box on your screen. We'll answer as many as we can, but given that we have over 1,000 registered for this webinar, I imagine we won't be able to get to every question. So we will be downloading all of your comments and questions, and we'll find ways to address them through other outlets. In addition, we're recording this webinar, and we'll post it on the NAEYC website where the rest of the position statement materials are housed. The purpose for the webinar today is to provide a context for the revisions, provide a high-level overview of key changes to the standards and competencies, and to talk about the next steps in the revision process. As you know, the draft standards and competencies are out for review, and we need your feedback. On the NAEYC website, you'll find a link to the survey where you can submit your comments, your questions, and your suggestions related to the revisions. And I also want to acknowledge that this draft does not include the leveling of the standards and the competencies to the Early Childhood 1, ECE 2, and ECE 3 designations that are recommended in Decision Cycles 3, 4, and 5 of Power to the Profession. A draft of those will be released later. We've made the decision first to focus on the standards and competencies content themselves to ensure that we get that right, and then to hold on diving deeply into the leveling until after the next iteration of Decision Cycle 3, 4, and 5 is released later this fall. I'm pleased to be joined today by three wonderful colleagues who've been engaged in leading and informing the revisions and who use the standards in their daily work. Elisa Huss-Hage is professor at Owens Community College in Ohio, and she is also a NAEYC governing board member and chair of the board's Early Learning Systems Committee, which is charged with shepherding the creation and revision of position statements. Sarah Lemoyne is Senior Director of the Professional Development and Workforce Innovations Department at 0 to 3, and her organization is a Power to the Profession Task Force member. She also serves on the work group that is informing the revisions to this position statement. Bweikia Steen is an Associate Professor at George Mason University, and she also serves as a member of the NAEYC Commission on the Accreditation of Early Childhood Higher Education Programs, which uses the current standards as standards for that accreditation system. As we know, these standards, they are a part of the foundation of our profession. They are used widely throughout it, and Kia will speak more to this later in the webinar. They are used as a framework for the preparation programs and influencing our professional development systems and state competencies. However, they are not used consistently within these various components of our profession. And as part of Power to the Profession, and Sarah will talk about this in just a minute, the intention is that these standards and competencies would be implemented and utilized consistently and meaningfully across all the components of the profession: preparation, licensure, accreditation, professional development, policy, and across all states. This draft position statement, as you'll see, is a revision of the NAEYC position statement on professional preparation. And as you can see in this graphic, NAEYC and the profession have long been engaged in setting standards for early childhood educators. This will be the 6th revision of this particular position statement. Each revision has been responsive to the particular context of early childhood education at that time. And as a set of standards, they continue to evolve. They began as standards for baccalaureate programs, then standards for associate degree programs were added, and then the standards shifted to focus on initial and advanced standards instead of standards for specific degree levels. In this current revision, the focus is on standards for initial or beginning early childhood educators. And as mentioned earlier, they will eventually be leveled to the expectations for the ECE 1, ECE 2, and ECE 3 designations laid out in Power to the Profession's Decision Cycles 3, 4, and 5. And another reason for sharing this slide is to remind us that we have a responsibility as a profession to update these standards and competencies, to continue their evolution. To be sure, there are some constants in this document that haven't changed over the decades, but we should also be comfortable making needed changes so that the standards and competencies are reflective of the best that we are learning from research and practice. So I'd like to turn this over to my colleague Elisa to talk with us about the process for the revisions and who is leading this work. So Elisa, it's yours.
Thank you, Mary. As the slide is explaining, we have a process that's being followed. As with all NAEYC position statements, the governing board will approve the final version of the revised position statement. The Early Learning Systems, or ELS committee as we call ourselves, leads the effort to revise position statements. The committee is a subset of the governing board. We also have representatives from each of NAEYC's key constituents, the Academy Council, the Higher Ed Commission, the Affiliate Council, as well as a member at large. That is the composition of the Early Learning Systems Committee. In addition to that committee, position statement work groups are used to inform the revisions to the position statements. Each work group includes the Early Learning Systems Committee, representatives from the Power to the Profession task force organizations, as well as subject matter experts that were vetted as the position statement revision work began. You will be able to find a list of all the ELS committee members and work group members in the final last appendix of the draft Standards and Competencies document, which is the current document we are looking at for revisions. Most important, though, as we look down the list of all those who were involved in this work, is the feedback provided by all of you. We know that the draft before you is not perfect, and we are looking to you to help us identify where more clarity is needed, where there are still gaps in the competencies, and where you feel that there is agreement with this draft. This draft is just currently where we are in this process, and we are depending on you to share your input as we continue to revise. Let me reiterate, this is just a draft. We know that there will be future iterations. This is a document in process, and we really welcome and look forward to your input.
Oh, thank you, Elisa. And now I'm going to turn this over to Sarah to talk with us about some of the drivers for the revisions, and in particular about how Power to the Profession is driving this work. Sarah, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be with you today. So there are several key drivers for the revisions to the standards and competencies. Starting with the top bullet on this slide, the Power to the Profession, as Mary referenced, and Elisa talked about too, as being part of contributing to this revision. So Decision Cycle 2 of the Power to the Profession really is about a unified set of general competencies for early childhood educators and how that is essential for the profession itself and needs to come from the profession. So from that Decision Cycle 2 is a recommendation that there be a revision to the NAEYC standards for initial and advanced professional preparation. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. A second driver is the cyclical review that happens anyway through NAEYC's quality assurance process, that ongoing review of position statements. The revision of the standards is taking place concurrently with revisions to the position statements on DAP and with the creation of the position statement on equity and diversity. And last but certainly not least, the former revision to this document, the last one, took place in 2009. It's certainly time for an update. We've had tons of important research and advances in practice and our understandings around quality assurance as well as diversity, response to current societal, demographic, professional, cultural context in which the early childhood profession operates. I'm going to dive a little bit more into the Power to the Profession piece, if you wouldn't mind. The next slide, please, Mary. Thank you. So, in developing unified competencies, that Cycle 2, Decision Cycle 2 of the Power to the Profession, that call for general competencies for early childhood educators, and it also made several recommendations in there related to those competencies. First, the Power to the Profession, or P2P, task force strongly agreed that we should not create a brand new set of competencies for early childhood educators. Our field's really fortunate already to have a number of sets of competencies that inform and support the work of early childhood educators. After the task force reviewed these competencies, they recommended that NAEYC standards for initial and advanced early competencies, early childhood professional preparation programs serve as the foundation for the competencies. The reasons for that were, first and foremost, these were the only set of competencies that were truly birth through 8 and that were applied across all early learning settings. Secondly, there were also identified important revisions needed in the standards. As we discussed a second ago, since 2009, we've learned a lot, both in terms of evidence-based and in terms of best practices. The revisions needed to incorporate and leverage standards from other organizations too, such as the one I represent, 0 to 3, BEC and CEC, NBPTS, and the Council for Professional Recognition, for example. The revised competencies really needed to incorporate gap areas that were also identified and summarized in the Transforming the Workforce report from the National Academy of Medicine back in 2015. This acknowledged the impact of stress and diversity on child development. It emphasized the need for more focus on social emotional development, working with dual language learners, technology-related gaps in terms of inclusion and equity and diversity needed to be elevated in all of the revisions as well, beyond how they're currently addressed in the preparation program standards at both an explicit level and embedded throughout. So those are some of the reasons for the Power to the Professions Task Force recommendations around the revision to the position.
Great,
I'm going to turn it to
Kia. Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Yep. Kia, it's all yours to talk a little bit.
Thank you, Mary and Sarah. I will be discussing the role of higher education, the role the standards play in higher education, and the role of accreditation using these standards. First, let's talk about the role of higher education. Higher education plays a vital role in providing education and training for educators, thus laying the building blocks needed to gain specific knowledge, skills, and competencies that lead to positive child outcomes. Next, the role of the standards. The NAEYC standards help to provide a unifying set of expectations for the teacher preparation programs. NAEYC standards matter because they help to set standards for higher education, identifying what early childhood educators should know, understand, and apply in order to ensure positive outcomes in all learning domains for young children. The standards require higher ed to undergo continuous program reflection and improvement, just as we want our educators to do. It informs our design and curriculum, our content and approach, and it plays a significant role in the design of coursework, and how we assess and reflect on what is and what isn't working, and how we stay abreast of current issues and trends. Through continuous improvement, the standards help to ensure that teacher preparation programs are providing candidates with multiple opportunities to reflect on the relationship and the connections between theories, research, and practice, and apply that knowledge appropriately in their classroom setting. The role of accreditation. The accreditation process is a commitment to continuous quality improvement that informs and supports the work of early childhood educators. Currently, 20% of the associate program degree programs are accredited through NAEYC. The accreditation of baccalaureate and master's programs began in 2017. 20% of bachelor's and master's degree programs are recognized by NAEYC with NCATE or CAPE. And I'd like to say that as a council member on the commission, I see firsthand the dedication and commitment teacher preparation programs foster to ensure early childhood educators are well equipped to meeting the varying needs of young children and their families. Next slide, please. Furthermore, these standards also play a very significant role in other parts of our profession. They serve as a framework for state certification or licensure, state early childhood or child care credentials, state approval of higher education programs, and state trainer approval systems. In conclusion, these standards matter because our young children are provided high-quality, intentional early care and education opportunities from intentional and knowledgeable early childhood educators. Thank you, Mary.
Great. Thank you, Kia. So we are going to now turn to the standards themselves and do just a high-level overview of some of the key changes that have been made in this draft revised position statement. I'm going to emphasize Elisa's emphasis that this is a draft, and we are very much looking for your feedback to help the work group and the Early Learning Systems Committee just better understand if the direction of the revisions is headed in the right way or if we need to make some shifts. So before we do that dive into the standards themselves, I wanted to just highlight what stayed the same in the revisions and then turn to what's changed just from the general perspective, and then we're going to go standard by standard. So we have in the draft made some significant revisions, but there are some things that have remained the same. And so you'll notice, let me turn the slide here, that'd be helpful. You'll notice that some of the categories, the categories of the standards themselves have stayed the same. So those categories around knowledge of child development, relationships with families and communities, assessment, et cetera, those categories have remained the same, as well as the flow within the standards, moving from what are now called key competencies, from the knowledge and understanding of that particular competency to application of those competencies. So you'll see within each of the standards, whether it's 1A, 1B, 1C, as you move further down the alphabet, it tends toward more application competencies. And each of these types of competencies is essential for early childhood educators, having that strong knowledge base and understanding of the competencies, as well as the application, being able to practice those competencies. And a third area that has stayed the same in the revisions is the core content in each standard. It is still really important for early childhood educators to understand child development and to understand the different kinds of assessments. So you'll see a lot of that core content remains the same or very similar. In terms of what's changed, well, the title of the standards themselves have changed. It's the Professional Standards and Competencies for Early Childhood Educators. As Sarah talked about with Power to the Profession, what the recommendations coming out of Decision Cycle 2 is that we have a core set of competencies for all early childhood educators. So in this revision, you'll notice the position statement now addresses that individual early childhood educator. It is not focused on professional preparation programs solely. So you'll see that change in the front matter of the position statement that lays out the context and the critical issues that are shaping the position statement, as well as in the recommendations. In addition, this position statement does include a set of recommendations at the end for key stakeholders in the profession. So for higher education, of course, the research community, legislative and regulatory bodies, and et cetera is included. And this follows the structure of the other position statements that are currently under review and revision at NAEYC. So we want to make sure we're keeping the structure of all of the position statements aligned with each other. And as I mentioned, what are currently called key elements within the standards are now called key competencies. So I saw that in the question box, coming through one of the question boxes. So I just wanted to clarify that as well. And we'll see that there have been some additional competencies that have been added in some of the standards. Part of that is due to an attempt to make the standards a little bit more readable and trying to ensure that each key competency really addresses one core concept. And so in places where we've looked at the current standards and seen multiple concepts addressed within a key element, we've tried to pull those apart so that they're really addressed separately. And we've also made some changes in terms of the supporting explanation. So in the current standards, as you read through them, you'll know that the supporting explanation follows all of the key elements. This time we've attached the supporting explanation to each of the key competencies to help hopefully make a little bit clearer the rationale and the explanation for each of those key competencies. So what we'll do now is just go standard by standard and highlight some of the changes. We're going to start with Elisa, who's going to talk about Standard 1.
Thank you, Mary. So we'll dig in a little deeper now, and the majority of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with some of this language. So we want to highlight specifically what we'll be looking at, what is being the suggested changes. So this standard, Standard 1, focuses on early childhood educators' knowledge and understanding of young children's development and the influences on that development. And it identifies how early childhood educators should apply this knowledge to create safe, healthy, and effective learning environments. In Standard 1, you'll see revisions that are responsive to the gaps identified in the Transforming the Workforce report, such as a focus on understanding the impact of stress and adversity on young children's development. You'll also notice attention to the social-emotional development of children. 1B is a new key competency that emphasizes knowing the individual child and recognizing the strengths and agency the child brings. In 1C and throughout the standards, we have pulled from the draft Equity and Diversity Position Statement to include an emphasis on the early childhood educator recognizing his or her own biases and how those beliefs, cultures, experiences, etc., influence their interactions with children. So that's kind of the high-level Standard 1. Mary, I think you're going to review Standard 2 for us.
Yep. Thank you, Elisa. Standard 2, as you all know, this is a standard that addresses educators' understanding of and ability to build relationships with families and community partners to support young children's learning and development. So in the revised draft, there's a stronger emphasis on valuing families' home culture and language, as well as understanding the funds of knowledge that families bring. We've also, throughout the revised position statement, drawn from the draft Equity and Diversity Position Statement as well. And so you'll see we've tried to pull some of those themes and notions into all of the standards, and it comes out particularly in 2A and 2B of Standard 2 here. There's also a higher emphasis on valuing not just diverse families, but valuing the diversity of families and communities and the different structures within each of those. And there's been a focus added on educators, early childhood educators, acknowledging their own biases around family structures and recognizing that and trying to dismantle that within themselves. 2C and 2D are highlighted on here. We've separated these into separate key competencies. So these are currently part of one key element in the current standards, and we've separated these out just to address because there are two different dimensions of this work in terms of developing partnerships with families and then developing partnerships with colleagues to support young children in learning. And I'm going to pass this on to Kia to talk with us about Standard 3.
Thanks, Mary. So Standard 3 addresses early childhood educators and their knowledge and use of assessments with young children. In the revisions, there is a stronger emphasis on understanding and using not just developmentally appropriate assessments, but also culturally and linguistically relevant assessments. In addition, there's a stronger emphasis on assessment and data literacy in the standard. You'll see that 3C and 3D are highlighted. They've been split into separate competencies as they address different dimensions of using assessments. The standard also addresses early childhood educators' understanding of how their own biases can influence their use of assessments and their analysis of the results. In addition, included in 3D is an expectation that early childhood educators know how to minimize the impact of inappropriate assessments in settings where educators do not have the autonomy to select appropriate assessments. These are all done to ensure that educators know, understand, and are effectively and efficiently conducting, analyzing, and reflecting on appropriate assessments for each child. And we'll pass it on to Elisa.
Thanks, Kia. And Standard 4 then addresses competencies related to instructional practice. In the revisions, 4B has been added to elevate a focus on differentiated instruction. The revisions also make clear that play is the foundational instructional strategy when working with young children. 4C identifies several important instructional strategies that early childhood educators should use in their practice. The list of strategies has been expanded and reordered in this revision. And I will hand it over to Sarah for Standard 5.
Thanks, Melissa. Sorry. So in Standard 5, the words or phrases that come to mind when we hear the word curriculum likely vary widely even across even just those of us on this webinar today. So the changes really that are addressed here in Standard 5 are crossing many different pieces that curriculum does. There's several components of content knowledge that early childhood educators need to know and be able to apply in their practice. The revisions themselves have better delineations between three things: content knowledge, the knowledge that early childhood educators should have of core disciplines; pedagogical content knowledge, the knowledge of how children learn in each discipline and how to support learning in the discipline; and common content knowledge, the knowledge that young children should know about each discipline. So in 5A and 5B, each competency is fleshed out to identify expectations around knowledge in the core discipline areas. 5D makes it clear that when working with young children, an integrated curriculum is critical, and that this curriculum should support the development of executive function skills in young children. I'll also add that curriculum is a term that may be more familiar in the education of older children and adults to refer to a structured series of lessons and coursework that will support the learner in achieving an identified set of learning goals. But this revision is hoping to take into account more about the helpful approach of thinking and learning to remember about children's brains, consisting of a network of connections between separate brain cells. This is particularly important in the first few years of life, and that emphasis and focus on the different age ranges as well as diversity and the other aspects of embedding and putting in explicitly that Tia, Mary, and Elisa have mentioned are also included in this one as well. Okay, Mary, thank you. This slide is showing us about Standard 6, professionalism as an early childhood educator. From everything from identification with the profession, understanding core standards and guidelines, to advocacy, to developing an inquiry mindset, working with colleagues, working across disciplines on behalf of children and families. It was really clear from the work group that this was a crucial standard and that it needed to resonate strongly with the early childhood educators and across the field, and needed to walk in step as well with a power to profession direction. 6F is a new key competency that addresses early childhood education educators' understanding of bias and the efforts to dismantle bias in their practice and within the profession and the community itself. Really, that self-awareness being key and our goal of intentional educators in their practice. 6G is also a new key competency. It's focused on the communication skills needed in early childhood educators, pulling it all together, those connections across people and how we communicate. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So that was just a high-level overview of some of the key changes in the standards. I wanted to share just a little bit about what we're hearing so far. As we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, there's a survey monkey that we're encouraging everyone to provide feedback on for these standards, and so that'll be open through November 16th. And what we've been hearing so far from that survey is that there really is strong support for the direction of the revised position statement. About 91% of the individuals responding thus far support where it's headed. And there's a strong level of agreement across the revisions in the standards, but there are concerns and questions that have been identified within that. And we're seeing agreement is strongest with where the revisions have headed for standards 1, 2, and 6. So those are, again, the focus on child development, building partnerships with families and communities, as well as with the professionalism standard. And in standards 3, 4, and 5, that's where we're seeing more concerns and questions being raised about the clarity of the language of the standards, as well as the balance between trying to be concise and detailed. And that's always the challenge with the position statements, is that we want to make sure that they do provide sufficient explanation of in this case, the competency that is in the particular standard, but also to be concise, because we recognize we don't want to have 5-page long competencies showing up in state early childhood competencies systems and in accreditation standards. So we really want to try to keep this balance between concise and detailed. And we've had really good representation thus far from the responses in terms of who's responding. So a really good mix of higher education practitioners, policy, regulatory representatives, and we've seen that reflected in the registration for this webinar as well. And we're really excited about that because we want these competencies to serve the entire profession, not just preparation programs, but for everyone. We want, and so it's particularly important that our practitioners, our early childhood educators are responding to this to help us identify, what's in there that is really important for early childhood educators to know, what's missing. So we're really excited so far to see who's engaging with the feedback of these. I'm going to turn it to Sarah to talk with us a little bit about ways to be engaged and to provide feedback on these standards.
Thanks, Mary. So ways to provide, as you just heard about, you can respond to the feedback survey that Mary mentioned. You can attend the position statement listening session at the upcoming NAEYC's annual conference next month. You can hold brown bag lunches with your colleagues. There's information up on the website and the overview and the draft that you can use to help frame it, but just have a conversation, take that leadership yourself to hold those discussions, and then send the feedback in whatever format works best for you into Mary. I actually didn't ask you. Who should they send that into if they hold that conversation with somebody? Can you jump in?
Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah, can you repeat that? I didn't catch the last piece.
Sure. So if they have these opportunities, other ways than the formal feedback survey and coming to the listening session, and they want to offer you a summary of the conversation they took the leadership to hold, who should they email that to?
They should email that to me. We will, when we send out the follow-up to this webinar, I'll include my email address in there as well. So certainly, because there are lots of formal and informal ways to provide feedback. So we are eager to get it through the survey, through emails, and whatever way people want to communicate that.
Thanks, Mary. So if there are other ideas than those that are highlighted here, which some are formal and informal, as Mary said, we encourage you to still engage in the way that's most meaningful for you and share back with Mary. Sorry, Mary. That's what she wants.
I hope my inbox is inundated. Great. Good. Well, at this point, we wanted to pause for a few moments to take questions from all of you. And again, I encourage you in your chat box, you can type in your questions there, and we will address those. If we don't get to particular questions, we'll, as I said at the beginning, try to find some other ways to get those answered and to address those in our various communication outlets. So I've been tracking some of the questions as they've been coming in, so I will start with those and we'll continue to monitor the chat box. So with that, I will ask some questions, and I'm going to throw these out to Sarah and Elisa and Kia, and feel free to say tag your it to me if you want me to take those questions since we can't see each other. But we've gotten a question around Standard 1 to ask about how trauma-informed care is addressed within the standards, and to see where that's played out. And we certainly know that that's an area that the Transforming the Workforce recommendations addressed as a gap area in the standards that they've reviewed for the work that piece did. So would either, particularly I'll put this to Elisa or Sarah, would you like to answer that question?
This is Elisa. Well, first of all, I believe when we have, there will be a lot of guidance as far as what that might look like in practice. When we have this final document and it is released and we're actually starting to use it, there will be a lot of resources that will also be offered. We know that trauma-informed care, Sarah, I know you have a term that you all use that I actually like better than trauma-informed care that has more to do with respecting the child and
wellness
yeah,
and practice. So we're not labeling, and that we are really looking at the whole child. And you're right.
Looking at that child, and the kid.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think that is such a topic that has really been elevated, and want to assure those who are asking that question that there will be significant guidance as we're looking at how we will be applying these standards in our everyday work.
And I think there's a lot, if I may just add quickly on that, I think there are a lot of good evidence-based curriculum and other pieces that are coming out that will need to ensure that they're aligned appropriately with the revised standards. But I think there are resources out there. I'll speak for 0 to 3. We have a lot on the wellness-informed practice with our underpinnings of infant and early childhood mental health. But we're not the only partners. We'll point, we'd all be happy to point through NAEYC as a facilitator to these type of resources that exist already.
Great, thank you. There was also just, it was more of a comment per se than a particular question, but someone commented that they appreciated the simpler language that was in Standard 2, and they were just commenting some of the language in the other standards is more complex. So I think there's just sort of an indication for all of us to keep in mind as we work on the next iteration of the revisions to really pay attention to language that we use and just thinking across everyone in the profession who we want to be using this. So let's see.
It's an interesting balance, isn't it, Mary, as we've looked to, assuring that the content is strong, but yet we've created a document that's readable and usable. So we definitely are attentive to that, and will continue to be as we're looking at not just the next iteration, but the final document for approval.
Great, that's right, Elisa. So we have, let's see, so we have seen, I'm just looking through the chat box again, so we have another question about where is play mentioned in Standard 4. So this is the standard around instructional practice. And I'm happy I've got the standards right in front of me, the draft copy, and so I encourage you to look at the explanation that's right below the title of that standard, which provides an introductory statement about what that standard is about. And you'll see within that there's a sentence calling out that play is a foundational instructional strategy with young children. So you'll see it there. And we certainly welcome comments about where else you might want to see this or how you think play should be elevated or positioned within this statement as well. Let's see, we had a question about the timeline for the final statement as we think about this. Elisa, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So right now we are anticipating that we'll be, this draft is currently available for feedback, as we've mentioned several times, until November 16th, at which point the revisions will all be looked at by the Early Learning Systems Committee and Work Group. We'll be reconvening in January, working before that, but actually physically reconvening in January when we'll be making those revisions, putting it out again for a second opportunity for public feedback. My understanding of the last look at the timeline is that we are hoping to have this in front of the governing board at their April governing board meeting for final approval. If for some reason we don't make that timeline, I would anticipate it would be in front of the governing board at the July meeting, and at that point, they will have the opportunity for final approval. But Mary, you could better address them. What would that look like? You know, as a faculty member myself from an accredited program, then moving forward, what would that look like as far as expectation on implementation? So I'm throwing the question back to you.
Well, it's a great segue because we've gotten some other questions related to what you just raised, Elisa. And so there's the current standards are also serve as the accreditation standards for NAEYC's higher education accreditation system. And so we've been getting a lot of questions about, well, what does this mean when the final position statement is approved by the governing board? What does this mean for accreditation? And so I wanted to clarify that the Commission on the Accreditation for Early Childhood Higher Education, of which KIA is a member, once these standards are approved, the Commission will then consider whether they would adopt the revised position statement and adopt the standards in those as the standards for the accreditation system, or consider a different way of incorporating them into the accreditation system. So the short answer about when will this impact accredited programs is probably not for a while, at the minimum for a year or two, because whatever decision the Accreditation Commission makes about its next set of standards, there will be a long period of time for grandmothering in programs and allowing them the opportunity to either pursue the new standards or utilize the current standards. Many programs are at a point where they're getting ready to renew their accreditation or they're in self-study, and we don't want to make them have to change direction mid-course in their work around that. So there will be ample opportunity or ample notice for programs when the new accreditation standards come out and time for them to adapt and implement those. Let's see. We have gotten just another question around the position statement, this particular position statement, and how it connects with other NAEYC position statements. So maybe Sarah or Elisa, if you want to talk about that piece.
Sure, this is Sarah. I can start, but Elisa, maybe you can bat at home here. I think you began, including both you and Mary, talked about the connection with the new diversity and equity position statement. So that revision is also walking hand in hand and being referenced really, I guess, in cycle with each other. So that piece is happening, and then there's the DAP piece as well that is happening at the same time. And obviously what we expect adults who work with young children to be able to know, understand, and be able to do needs to be reflective of both of those statements. We have to have it walk in sync with those who are going to implement the developmentally appropriate practices. So alignment needs to happen there, and Mary and or Elisa, you can share details on the pause and walk together on that, I'm hoping, as far as the concrete timeframe or approaches, if you don't have timeframe.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I'll elaborate further, and then Mary, you can maybe fill in if there's some additional information to share. But as we're looking at, the advantage of these position statements all being considered at the same time is that we really have been very intentional with this lens of assuring that they have all aligned with one another. As you have all had an opportunity to provide feedback on the equity and diversity statement, similar to what's going on now with the standards and competencies, we've been very reflective to assure that those issues that have been raised and celebrated and highlighted and elevated through the equity and diversity statement are reflected in what now plays out as our practice through these competencies and standards. Likewise, as Sarah mentioned, we are currently considering a revision of the developmentally appropriate practice statement because we know today's practice really reflects different research and our attempt to access policymakers. We really want to be more current in the way that we're looking at that DAP statement. So DAP is certainly foundational when we talk about our practice, and we want to make sure that all three of these statements are aligned with one another and that children are at the heart of it, and that we can really leverage these works to impact policy and improve as we're working with power to the profession and elevating our field, that we can really leverage all of these statements to help us do just that.
Great. Thank you, Elisa and Sarah. We've had some more comments and questions related to practical application of these standards. So I think that's going back to, I think, that the challenge we talked about a little bit about trying to be concise and yet detailed in these standards. There's been some questions and comments about, well, what would this look like in action? How would this be measured? How would programs measure this? Perhaps in their candidates, the preparation programs. So just thinking about the kinds of guidance that we might be able to release with this position statement. And I think I can say if it's from the NAEYC staff level, we're thinking about the kinds of resources that we need to accompany this document. And so the position statement itself, all of the position statements tend to stay pretty high level in terms of the content for them, but we are very aware that if we want them used and implemented, that needs to be some really practical guidance about how to do that. So we're thinking about that. I've seen some comments in the chat box here about, how do we measure this in our assessments of candidates who are in our programs. So I want to assure everyone that we are very much thinking about this as well in terms of that practical application. And I didn't know for Kia or Elisa or Sarah if you have other thoughts just on kind of I think the challenge that it is with the position statement, trying to stay high level but also practical in nature as well.
Well, I think the beauty of having such a diverse group involved in the writing, those questions are being asked all the time. And so in the background, what a lot of people don't see are those exact conversations. For example, I have my faculty hat on, and so when I'm looking at these, those are the questions I'm also asking. So I guess just to assure everyone that with the depth of expertise on the work group as well as the Early Learning Systems Committee, we're trying to assure that at all levels, how these are being as these are being developed, that we will be sensitive and intentional about the resources that are available. And as Mary mentioned, the staff is already hard at work behind the scenes about creating some of these packages of these toolkits to help us all be able to implement once we've actually landed on what the final competencies and standards will be.
Yeah, I think just that was wonderfully stated by both of you. This is Sarah, and just to add on to that, I do think, the details and the practice of what does this look like, that level of skill statement for early childhood educators would be tying our hands to have in here. And it's wonderful, but it's also burdening. I know that difference between that struggle, as you were labeling it, Mary, between enough detail to be clear about what we're after, but enough flexibility to meet the desired overall outcome in context for the different purposes. But that level of detail is really, getting into the curriculum levels. In addition to the guidance that you're providing, there are specialized competencies from partners that are also pointed to for specific target areas, not for the general, which is why these are so important across for all early childhood educators.
Great, thank you, Sarah. We've had a question about, are there any changes coming to Standard 7? And so that's a great question. I'm glad that was asked. In the current standards, you'll know there's a Standard 7 around field experiences that was very specific to preparation programs. So given that the shift of the position statement is now on the individual early childhood educator, the revised position statement addresses Standards 1 through 6. Standard 7 will still be, field experiences will still be part of the accreditation system, and so that is very much on the Commission's mind as they're thinking about the revision of the standards for the accreditation system as an update to Standard 7 and around field experiences. We've had another question about the leveling as we think about leveling these standards to the ECE 1, 2, and 3 designations, and their question, the specific question is about at one point will the leveling be addressed? And so I thought I can kick this off, but we do intend when we do the second public draft to have that draft leveling accompany it. And for those who have not had a chance to dig into decision cycles 3, 4, and 5 of Power to the Profession, within those recommendations, it does lay out 3 preparation program pathways for the early childhood educator 1, 2, and 3. And essentially those are tied to professional training programs, associate degree programs, and baccalaureate and initial master's degree programs. And so the intention is that these standards and competencies that we've been discussing today would then eventually be mapped to each of those designation levels and would lay out what would the expectations be for an ECE 2, for example, from an associate degree program? What's the expectation for the mastery of competencies for graduates of those programs? So that will be coming down the pike, and I didn't know if my co-presenters had anything to add to that particular question.
Yeah, this is Sarah. Mary, I think you summarized it really well. Stay tuned, right?
Yep.
All right.
Agreed.
So I think at this point we are reaching the end of our hour. So I did want to turn it over to Elisa for some final remarks and to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Mary. And keep the questions coming because we want everyone to feel comfortable and ready when it is time for us to start really using these new standards and competencies. So the public comment period is open, and we are eager and anxious to hear from all of you. You can find a link to the feedback survey on NAEYC's website at naeyc.org/resources/position dash statements. Within the survey, you will have the option to provide general feedback on the document or to provide specific feedback on each section of the document and each standard. The survey asks for feedback on the content in the standards and competencies as well as clarity on the overall document. The survey will be available for your consideration and feedback until November 16th. As Sarah mentioned, there will also be at the NAEYC annual conference, there will be a listening and feedback session. We welcome you to join us. That will be on Thursday morning from 8 to 9:30. That's November 15th. The Work Group and Early Learning Systems Committee will review all feedback and make further revisions to the document. Similar to the process we are currently following, after those revisions have been made based on your valuable feedback, a second draft will be released for public comment. The second draft will include the draft leveling that we were just speaking of and will also include a glossary. We anticipate the next draft to have a release in the new year, January 2019. So be watching for that next opportunity to contribute to this work. We really value your voice. And I think we'll just say thank you then. Thank you for your engagement, for your interest, for being on this webinar today. I personally want to thank Mary Harrill, the Senior Director at NAEYC's Higher Education and Accreditation Program Support. Without Mary, we would not have been able to pull this webinar off, and the behind-the-scenes folks there, Cass is running things, so we just are very grateful to have had this opportunity today, for you all making it possible to have this webinar, and to all of you who were on the webinar to further inform yourselves as we move forward. So please get on that survey and get your feedback submitted. Thank you for your time today.